Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the Cram Podcast. Well, there was a recent survey that was done of employees in 40 countries, and these were college and university grads. Well, where do you think people work the most number of days from home? Canada. Are you surprised? Canadian employees worked an average of 1.9 days per week from home. The UK and the US rounded out the top three. Asian countries had the lowest levels when it came to remote work. But remote and hybrid work, they have their downsides. According to the latest Harvard Business Review and some other sources, there's growing evidence that remote and hybrid work can have a dampening effect on job performance. And there are other issues as well, such as high turnover, isolation, loss of collaboration, managing remote workers, just to name a few. Nita Chhinzer is an expert on our changing work world. She's an associate professor in HR and management consulting in the Department of Management at the Gordon S. Lang School of Business and Economics at the University of Guelph. And she joins us. Hi, Nita.
Thanks for having me on. It's an interesting topic and people are quite polarized on it. So let's see if we can educate.
Yeah, love it. Okay, yeah, really want to get into this on a deep dive. So I also saw this Stats Can report, and I guess it quantified the amount of remote work that Canadians were doing. And it said that almost 1/4 of employed Canadians either work partially or completely remotely. And then, of course, the Stanford University study that I just mentioned, it talked about the Canadian post-secondary grads who are working, and they had the highest number of remote days a week at 1.9 days. What's your reaction to that?
I'm not surprised at all. And the reason why I'm not surprised about the Stanford study, at least Canada being the highest, is Canada also is quite geographically dispersed. And when you have geographic disbursement, companies have to compete more for talent. And that means that they might have to look for someone who's outside of their geographic region to be employed. In fact, pre-COVID, our numbers were showing about 11 to 13% of people were working exclusively remotely or had the option to also work hybrid. So remote work isn't something that just happened in the last 5 years. In fact, I was working remotely when I worked for Nortel Networks in 1999. So Canada has a long history of trying to access talent using different methods of communication, different methods of where people work. So this work from home trend really catapulted because of the COVID pandemic, but this number here, 25%, is actually less than it used to be.
Oh,
so
that is
during the
interesting.
COVID pandemic, we saw a big jump. And a lot of that comes from the fact that in Canada, we have a large portion of our population who work in knowledge work, who are doing things like services, accounting, education, and they're able to do that from using the tools that they just have. So their basic laptop, their mouse, their keyboards, they can do that as long as they have internet access. However, there are a bunch of jobs that aren't even qualified for remote work. And I think that sometimes what's lost in that conversation is that remote work is not your right. It's a privilege. And it's a privilege that the companies try to capitalize on to access talent and retain talent. But there's a whole lot of workers. I'm talking police officers, doctors, nurses, social care workers, manufacturing workers, delivery workers, a lot of people who work in accommodations and food industry who don't have the privilege to work from home. So that 25% number doesn't surprise me. And it seems high, but we do have a lot of people who simply don't have that privilege.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I'm glad you brought that up. Do you know, one of the things that's been talked about a lot is performance, job performance in a hybrid or remote model. And now I remember hearing during the pandemic, I mean, there was a lot of talk about that. And I heard that employees, they were being just as productive or even more productive when they were working from home. That's something that was just talked about. And I want to know whether that was true, because now it seems like there's indicators, oh no, people are not as productive at home. So can you just clarify what's happening?
So what I think is important is to think about performance broadly. And there's job performance, which is, are you good at your job? So that's your task component of job performance. So if you are working as a taxi driver or an Uber driver, are you doing your deliveries on time? Are you doing good customer service, etc. But then there are components of your job that are contextual. And contextual is how frequently do you help advance things? How frequently do you take initiative? How frequently do you help others? How frequently do you innovate and collaborate? And there were some studies done about 20 years ago that showed the top performers weren't just good at their job. In fact, they were good at the context stuff too, the contextual performance. And that's what was missing. So in these traditional measures of job performance, if we're only just looking at the tasks, so how many grievances were reviewed by a grievance committee? The number might be equal to what it was before, but that's just the task that they're required to do. There's a whole bunch of initiative that happened when we were face to face. Things like talking to other people, understanding the pulse, looking beyond your job, thinking about maybe getting a committee together and initiating some training processes or innovations. And that's what was missing when we all went remote, is that yes, our productivity did increase on our tasks, but we did not see contextual performance go up. And a lot of people after a few years, they looked up and they were like, wait a minute, the company's making these changes? I didn't even know that was on the agenda. Wait a minute, I have a new manager's manager? I didn't even know that was happening. Wow, this unit is being merged. Why is it being merged? I don't understand why. And what we found is people lost the pulse of where they fit in the organization, amongst their coworkers, amongst the managers, what the new initiatives are. And a lot of that stuff didn't come down to, are you good at your job? And there's some people who are great at their jobs and they can work remotely and keep their head down and they're great worker bees. But for the most of us, we generally want to be aware of what's going on around us. And that's what was lost.
Okay. So you say most of us, because what I was wondering is, does it depend on, what sector you're working in? Like what kind of job? So, like let's say you're in some high tech firm as opposed to maybe you're in a boutique marketing agency or you're working for a charity, right? Like, so can we say anything about that?
Definitely. So it's not the sector specifically, it's what's your role. So it's more occupation specific. So if we take a look at an accountant does largely independent work. And someone, say an audit, has to spend a lot of time looking at data analytics. And so for them, their job's not as interconnected. But if we're speaking then about a strategy person or a marketing person or a customer service rep, they're the ones who have to get out there and pay attention to what's going on. Their jobs are more connected with other people and their tasks are less independent. So the option of working from home just isn't realistic for them. This is what we also saw in Canada with the public sector strike that happened earlier this year. It was Canada's largest public sector strike. And a big outcome of that was that no, the management didn't agree that they would come up with a standard policy that everyone gets to work from home. They said it's job by job. We can't have a principal choose to work from home 2 days of the week. We can't have a surgeon choose to work from home 2 days of the week, but maybe we can have a bookkeeper or someone who's responsible for email messaging or some sort of tech updates responsible for working remotely. So it really came down to, it's not the industry, it's the job. How connected is your job? How forward-looking is your job? How much do others depend on you? And there's also a whole component here of flex work that people misunderstand. So can I take a second here to talk about flex work?
Let's talk about that. Yeah.
So a lot of people confuse the concept of remote work with flex work. Flex work means that you get to decide when you start and end your job. So when you start and end your day. Some people might do like an early morning shift. They might do 7 till 11, take a break in the day and come back and do 3 till 8. And even those jobs are highly dependent on who else is relying on you. And so you can be working in the office and have flexible time. And the argument that was made to stay at home was, I can go to the doctor's and I can pick my kid up from school. That's all great. You can do that with some flexibility. And I've seen a big shift to people who are now working in the office for a little bit of time, but then coming home and at 3:00 they're getting online and doing the rest of the follow-up after they've picked up their kids. So flex time means you get to determine when you start or end within the parameters of the workplace. And remote work means you can work not just from home, but from anywhere. You could work from a coffee shop. You can work from a library. You could work from the cottage. And that actually was quite prolific even earlier. We used to have these companies that allowed you to go in and, rent out space. Staples really got into that space, right? Trying to rent out space. And WeWork was huge because people, even when given the option, were feeling isolated and they wanted a common place to go and work.
I wonder, do the studies show, generally speaking, it is better for people to at least have some time together and work than not at all?
The studies are so telling. So the studies say it's not how many hours you spend together in the same physical location. It's what are you doing with those hours? And that's where I think the return to office really failed for so many companies, right? They were bringing people back and they weren't bringing them back in their work batches. They were saying, we want to give you the flexibility. So you decide what days of the week you come back. And people were coming in on Tuesday, although their coworkers were at home on Tuesdays. So they were commuting into the office to a big empty space with nobody that they collaborated with and getting online all day long while they were at work.
Yeah. All
right. It was useless. It was a fail that way. And a lot of that communication that we've done since those experiences is, those of us who are HR thought leaders say, bring people in together in their clusters. Say that everybody who shares, whose job is interconnected, comes in on standard days. Have Group A come in Monday and Wednesday. Have Group B come in Tuesday and Thursday. You could alternate Fridays. And then there are even some companies that have gone so far that say that when you come into the office, you're not allowed to be on virtual calls. Those days that you're in the office are meant to really capitalize on that face-to-face space. There was some research that came out of Harvard too, and found that people who were going into the office were still feeling very lonely. And a way that you can overcome that is do things like offer common areas for people to get together and have food, is to not have meetings that start and end and it's all organized, is to bridge in like 15 minutes in your meeting so people could talk. Mm-hmm. When we come into the office, we're heading to a meeting. For the first 10 minutes or so, we're getting caught up. We're saying, I ran into this problem, this thing happened, that thing happened. Even if we work remotely and we give people time to talk about what's happening, so not every minute of a meeting is occupied, that gives them a forum to really share ideas. So bringing people back to the office originally failed. And unfortunately, we're still seeing companies that are failing at that, which is why people don't want to go back to the office. It's not adding value. But in many organizations, we can improve that by just being more strategic about when we ask people to come back, who we ask to come back, and what kind of support we give them when they come back. Honestly, people gather around food. And so the Harvard Business Review was right? They were like, get people out. Yeah, we used to have this habit in one of my old employers where every Tuesdays and Thursdays, we would do cake and coffee at 2. It was perhaps the most productive half hour in the entire week, because you just were sitting there and you were having coffee and cake and talking to your friends and you were solving problems. You were sharing ideas. You were learning more about your coworkers. And that isolation is experienced by people who are both working remote and working in the office. So unfortunately, workplace isolation, it doesn't depend on where you work. It depends on how connected you are with the people you work with.
Right. I honestly wonder though, because this is a topic of conversation, right? We're all talking about this, how we work, where we work, all that. Yeah. And when I talk to people, colleagues, friends, family, something I hear quite often is they know that it's good for them to work with other people, to have that connection. The meetings are better. So on, like they know about the advantages intellectually, but yet they balk at the idea of going into work, because then they give me this whole list of like, oh my gosh, the commute time is ridiculous. And I can get so much more done at home. And then I'm home immediately and I can see to the kids and dinner. So they resist. And I want to know how strong that is. Even though you may know it's better, you don't want to go there.
It's almost like we're getting back into like Einstein's basic theory, right? The theory of relativity. Objects in motion stay in motions and objects at rest stay at rest, right? So those habits have been lost in terms of getting up and doing the commute and getting to work and saying hi to a few people on the way in. In fact, we've got some ridiculous situations where I'm helping some companies where people are joining virtual meetings and now they feel anxious about having their camera on. And they're like, having my camera on while I'm in virtual meetings is making me anxious. Yeah. So we've lost that ability for some of us, have lost the ability to actually socialize and know what it means to socialize again. and what the value we get is from socializing. And that again can happen remotely. You could easily pick up the phone. How many times have some of us gotten a text from a friend? Oh, I'll get back to them. I'll get back to them. I'll get back to them. And then we get static and we don't get back to them.
Yeah.
Or how many times do we say, oh, tomorrow I'm going to start my workout. Tomorrow I'm going to eat healthy, right? So that's why the mandates have been coming forth, is to reset the patterns that people can come back to the office. 2 days of the week became 3 days of the week are becoming 4 in some organizations, because if we let objects at rest stay, they'll stay resting. And so it is hard. It is hard. And if we don't create environments that make it worthwhile to come back to, right? So I don't know if you remember, but you go into the office, your coworker's daughter's birthday, the janitor's first name, you would know what days something was going on. It was just a certain level of busyness. And I've been researching a lot about the loneliness epidemic. And people are not just alone like at work, they're alone at home too. We're seeing fewer children being born, fewer marriages, people later in life. There's a temporarity to how long you could be lonely. And we know that loneliness is then connected to a number of other factors, like your overall wellness, even your longevity.
Yeah.
Right. And so that loneliness epidemic's not just happening in Canada, that's happening globally. And so this pressure we might be feeling that, oh, I don't want to go back to work because I'm used to my patterns. I had people say to me, I don't want to go back to work because I really love cuddling with my dog at lunch, or I don't want to get ready to go to work. And I had to stop the person and be like, that is not a legitimate reason, right? Like that is not good for you in the long run. And education like this should hopefully help people recognize that, those kinds of habits, they matter. A lot of research that's been done on stress reduction and resilience shows that people who just basically go for a walk outdoors have higher levels of resilience, higher level of cognitive performance, higher health levels overall. Yet how many of us go for a walk outdoors every day? So few of us. So it's just about forcing the patterns that can help us get back. And I don't want to sound like I'm all pro return to the office. I'm not. I think it can be done right. And most organizations are not doing it right now. But I think that there's a bigger social health, bigger community identity that we really have to work towards. And whether that is in the workplace or whether it's outside of the workplace, that's still debatable. But I do think that it's a big step towards overcoming the loneliness epidemic.
Yeah, just before I do want to get into how do we do it right? How do companies do it right for both them and the employees? I want to talk about what is the downside if you are at home and even that isn't being managed properly, right? Working from, doesn't have to be home, but working remotely or doing a hybrid model. When I look at these things like high turnover, the way people quit, the way people get fired, all those things, is that related to, in fact, remote and hybrid work and the way it's being handled?
Some of that and some of the structural changes that have happened.
Okay.
So, for example, if I have a remote worker and I'm going to have to do performance management for them, or I have to fire them, how do I get the tools back? How do I disconnect them from technology? How do I ensure that information's not being shared? How do I ensure that I'm not being recorded and then I'll be blasted on YouTube the way some of these people like, Brittany Peach have blasted her layoff notice on YouTube and became a viral hit, right? So there's this fear here that we lose control. Beyond that too, there's an environment that people are working in that they're not taking seriously. So there was a running joke at the start of COVID. People were using their ironing boards as their desks. They were using their beds as their desks. Not everybody has the luxury of having a home office and the right ergonomic tools. The other thing that we found too is people who work from home are much more sedentary in terms of the number of steps that they take per day over people who work in the office. Because when you're in the office, you get bored. You go for a walk to the water cooler, you go for a walk down the halls, you just go and stare out a window for a while, right? You actually are a little bit more mobile. And so there's those effects too. So I don't think it just comes down to, are you more productive? I think it comes down to, are you living a full life when you're so isolated? And that works for a lot of people. I know a friend who's been in payroll and she's been working exclusively from home for the last 15 years and it works for her, but it doesn't work for everyone. And stats show us that there's an equal number of people who want to go back to the office as there are who want to work from home.
Really?
So what companies
an equal number. Really?
Yes,
an equal number want to go. That surprises me.
There's a lot of people who can't find work-life balance at home. They always get disturbed. They don't have a quiet place to work. They feel isolated. They don't know how to answer questions. They want someone to give them performance advice.
But you know what? Okay. So I find that interesting also though, because I hear a lot of people also say, hey, you know what? I can do without the aggravation and the conflict with some of my coworkers because I don't like some of them. And this way I get to avoid them and stay at home. I do hear a lot of that.
Of course.
So,
yes.
Yeah.
Of course.
So who would want to go back into that situation? Yeah.
I don't like conflict with people either. But if I don't learn how to navigate healthy workplace conflicts, if I don't learn de-escalation techniques and practice those, if I don't accept the ideas of people who don't share my values, then I am becoming much more stubborn in my way, right? So even going to the office or going to a team that you join or some fitness activity or going to, maybe you join a drama club and you hear opposing views helps you become much more aware of the diversity of thought, diversity of opinions, and much more accepting of other people. Like there's this weird thing happening right now where yes, that isolation does happen. But if the argument is that I am unable to deal with people who think differently than me, or who have personalities that are differently than me, and so I choose to opt out of those environments, you are not developing the social skills you need to succeed. We're in an extremely disruptive time, right? We're talking about AI, we're talking about job redesign, we're talking about high levels of geopolitical risk and threat. We're talking about affordability crisis. There's a lot going on that people have to build that resilience and that adaptability and that awareness towards. There's people both in the office and out of the office that have high levels of entitlement right now. So we saw things like the rate of violence at work go up, especially for people who were in public sector jobs, like the rate of air rage went up. The stewardesses were really being put at risk. People have lost their tempers. They've lost their understanding of how to behave in a broader society, how to accept someone else's opinion. And there's a weird phenomenon going on where we are creating a subculture with some people who believe that they have the right to advocate for their opinion and have their views heard, but others don't. And that's super unhealthy. So I would reject anyone who says to me that they don't want to go to the office because they don't want to deal with the drama or the conflict. That is unhealthy in my opinion.
Yeah. I want to talk to you about quitting and firing and whether, if you work remotely, is that an easier thing to do, to quit and to fire someone?
Much easier to quit, I'm sure, because you have less invested that day or in that workplace, right? You don't have to go back and collect things. Also, your social ties may be a little bit more, you can find alternative ways to keep those social ties happening. For example, if you get along really well with a coworker, maybe you're used to having a WhatsApp group with them. And so you've already got that alternative up and running. So that can help you if you want to quit as well. There's a certain amount of guilt when you quit, that you're abandoning your employer. And we know that when we're working virtually, that bond might not be felt as strong, especially for people who were onboarded completely remotely and never actually had that experience of the cultural integration.
Well, can I ask you something about that? Yeah. So let's just say someone is onboarded virtually, plus they work remotely, right? That's all they do.
Yeah.
So they never actually have met anyone, because I know this to be true. Two people. Yeah. And then they actually ended up quitting, never having met anyone. Then they go on to another job. Again, it's a virtual and they're working in tech, right? And I just think that is so bizarre, never to come in touch with a human being.
It is. And what we're seeing too is that networking is the number one way to get a job right now. So even if you do get fired and you don't have strong networks, people who are willing to vouch for you, people who know your skill set, people who've got a personal investment in your career success and are willing to make a connection for you, then it's going to be harder for you to find a job. So we do know that quitting is easier remotely than face to face, because of the guilt factor and because of the physical nature of not having to physically move your office. It's harder to fire people. Some of the fear that I'm hearing from HR departments and managers is they're afraid that things are all being recorded and there's nothing that's considered private anymore. There's fear of sabotage, that if you fire someone, they might go because now they've got all the client files. How do you actually lock up their computers and stuff?
Yeah.
There's also fear that when I fire someone, they don't have the resources available, and nor do I have the ability to understand when they might be in crisis. And so when I fire someone remotely, if I do it face to face, I can not just listen to the words, but I can understand their body language better. But if you look at how big you are and how big I am, if I'm fidgeting and my knee is shaking and I'm giving off the signals that I might be in crisis, you wouldn't know that. And very few managers are trained on how to identify that. So if I fire you, you don't even have time to detox. You just close up the computer and then have to sit in a room and decide what to do next, as opposed to me being able to identify when you might need a little bit more help, me being able to escalate for you, you being able to go talk to a colleague and say, this is what happened, you having the drive home to detox, and then at least, being in a safer environment that way. So I do worry a little bit about remote firing. When it comes to onboarding,
sorry, can I just ask you, is that more and more common? So remote firings are increasing rather than doing it? Yeah. Okay.
Remote firings, it's common simply because there's more people working remote.
Yeah.
That's the issue, right? People all worked on Mondays, firings on Mondays would be more common, right?
Yeah.
But the onboarding is interesting because I know some companies, especially in the finance industry, who are saying that even if you get hired to work a remote job, for the first 3 months, we want you to come in because we want you to understand not just your job, but the culture of the organization. We want the leaders to get to know you. That's our time to actually give you the most amount of performance appraisals, the most review, because you're on your probationary period. So that's when we need to be able to have the highest level of visibility. I know other organizations that are calling their low performers back in, saying that you've been working from home, but you're not performing at the levels that others are performing at. So come back in and we could figure out how to develop you. So it's not being done to harm people all the time. Sometimes it's being done to equalize people's performance or to give them a better platform to represent the organization from.
When companies, and there've been, a number of big companies that have called employees back in, when that happens, there seems to be a skepticism, right? Well, like, why? What is this? What's going on? Like, what do you know about that? What's the main reason why a lot of large companies are bringing people back?
Well, it's a mix, right? We have some companies that are still very much pro remote work, and they've found ways to capitalize on that and do it right. And they found ways to access talent and evaluate talent and develop talent and make people feel connected even remotely. The ones who are calling people back, it could be, like we hear the stories, right? It could be because they are hoping to bring people back to develop them. They're hoping to rebuild their culture. The company's going through a period of disruption or change, and they're finding it hard to navigate that change online. For example, if there's a new initiative, when you send out an email about the new initiatives, you can actually see who's opened and read the emails. And there are employers out there who the CEO sends out a letter and only 60 to 70% of people even bother to open that letter. So
I even think that's high. That even seems high to me.
It's that high. Yeah. People don't, let alone when they open it, are they understanding what they're reading? Right. And then who do they go to for help? They go to their managers for help. And their managers might be disconnected from what's going on. So the managers feel unsupported. In fact, I've got a really successful consulting career when it comes to helping middle managers navigate that strategy. Leadership is giving them a direction and they have to then implement that direction. So there is that business, but it's harder to do remotely. And so for those reasons, we see people come in. And then we've heard of the more nefarious reasons. For example, maybe an organization needs to do some downsizing and they feel that they have too many employees. So they're going to call back to the office and say, anyone who doesn't want to come back, that's fine. That means that you're effectively abandoning your job. You quit. And that's a good way for them to reduce their headcount, in their opinion. There are others that are saying that we want to call people back so we can begin to differentiate the strong from poor performers, because managers are afraid to give poor performance reviews. So everybody comes in at exceptional. And if the company was in fact so exceptional, it's not succeeding. So what's going on? So they want to do a little bit problem solving. And I've heard more weird reasons. Generally there's a public sentiment that companies already paid for their real estate. And they're saying,
I've heard that
got all this
yes.
empty real estate, let's bring the people back. I don't know how I feel about that one, but I've heard that before.
Yeah. I think I might have talked to you about this before, but a couple of sort of catch terms like, the quiet quitting and the quiet firing. Is that still a thing? Are those things still a trend or?
Yeah. So quiet quitting was just something started by some TikToker who made it a thing, right? Yeah. But quiet quitting was this idea that people were saying, I'm going to do my job and just my job and nothing more and nothing less. And these are people who perhaps were really great at their job, but maybe being taken advantage of because of, jobs consolidating or having too much work put on their plate. And they were drawing their fair boundaries to protect their space. But the counter to quiet quitting is the hustle culture. And so we have people like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson going on about, if you hustle, you're going to succeed. And we have people who are multiple job holders or they're doing a little bit extra at work. Yeah. And so there's this whole diversity in how people are operating when they are remote or in the office, doesn't matter. But, there are people who are saying, I want to draw my boundaries, and others who are saying, I'm going to commit. I'm going to give it my all. Whatever I do, I'm going to do it more than 100%. What's interesting that we haven't talked about yet, Mary, is the fear employers have, and it's a legitimate fear, that people are doing not enough work and they haven't caught on to the fact that we could actually capitalize on that lost time or the wasted time. So I give someone a task and I think that they're working full time, but in fact, they're working 2 hours a day.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Yeah. And in fact, I've heard some of them have another job.
Yes, and the multiple job holders. And so multiple job holders, they're working for 2 employers, often simultaneously, often without the employer knowing. And that ends up burning out the employee. That might end up with a conflict of interest. And that also represents lost value for the employer. So I know of a few people who I've given better advice to who have been working for 2 companies full time at the same time. And I'm like, are you kidding me? And they're like, well, I'm a project manager. So in this role, I only have to be called on these times. So I'll work extra if I need to one day, but I can handle both jobs. And that's where the employers are saying, wait a minute, there's so much going on. There's new technology, new ways to work, new processes. Maybe people don't need to be employed in the capacity that they currently are. And they want to bring people back to figure that out.
Yeah. I mean, as far as how do managers keep track of performance during the day, right? I mean, because there was something about, there was another
monitoring.
Oh yeah. Okay. We could talk about that. E-monitoring. I just also recently heard, although this isn't really keeping track of performance, it's more how often are you coming in, but there was this thing about badging. What was that term? Right? Where okay. Anyway, what it was is, you go to the office because it's required that you should come to the office, let's say X number of days a week, and you sign in with your badge, right? Yeah. Electronically, but then you just go, coffee badging. That was it. So you have a coffee, but then you leave, but it indicates that you were at the office, right? So you just do that because you don't really want to hang around and you don't really want to work there. So I don't know how common that is either.
When we talk about the nefarious practices of management, we're not talking about the employees who are taking advantage of the situation. What you're talking about to me, Mary, is employees who are taking advantage of the situation, right? The ones who are the multiple job holders without discussing that with their employers, the ones who are coming into the office to have a coffee and wasting 3 hours of their day coming in and out, not producing anything, not talking to anybody, not doing anything. If you're coming in to have a coffee with a colleague who you do work with and you're going to talk about work and network and learn new ideas, that's all fine. But, there is that really weird business here where the people who do work from home, some of them are unfortunately not productive. And they've been hiding that lack of productivity. So companies did shift to e-monitoring.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't to build a culture of fear. It was trying to figure out when people were working and when they weren't. There was a recent case where a woman had to pay back her employer for just 1 month. She had to pay back $2,600. She claimed she was working on files, but the printing records showed that she never did the work. And she billed the company for that time. But luckily, through e-monitoring, they were able to say, oh, well, her printing didn't show that she printed it. She didn't even access the files. She wasn't working those hours, but yet she was, unjustly billing the company. We also had cases, especially out of Hamilton, Ontario, where the city of Hamilton workers who are responsible for road repairs, they put GPS in their cars and their trucks. And they found that they were working on average less than 4 hours a day. And for the remaining time, their truck was at a lunch place. Sometimes their truck was at their house. And they actually went through a mass firing as a result of that e-monitoring, where even the city saying, we're hiring you to go fill potholes and deal with these construction issues, but you're working 3 or 4 hours a day. And so, that becomes a bloated workplace, especially when taxpayer money is involved. But even profitable companies don't want to see that kind of bloat. They don't want to see that kind of surplus.
Yeah, let me just start with that. I mean, I get that. That is not a good thing, but that must create this whole culture of suspicion and fear among good employees, right? Because if you're a good employee, I don't want to be tracked like that. To me, so how, I don't know, what is the best way? Is that the way that's going to work, or is there a better way where you don't create?
So the culture of trust is created by a series of things. It's your competence, your frequency with how much you communicate, and the speed with which you communicate. So for example, Mary, if you send me a message and I get back to you pretty soon saying, I don't have the answer yet, but I'll get it to you, and then I actually competently deliver that, that'll build our trust, right? The third component of trust. So it's your competence, it's your speed at which you communicate and frequency. And then the third component is your kindness. If you're generally kind, people will trust you. And so those three components are really about trust building rather than fear mongering. And fear mongering is, in fact, some employers have been burned. Some employees have been burned. And now they're really skeptical and they're drawing their boundaries and they're saying, I don't want to be taken advantage of. And in those kinds of workplaces, that is unfortunately management by fear. And we see that tracking mechanisms being used. We see punishment being given. For example, if you're late, it doesn't matter why you're late, you'll be written up. Those kinds of things happening. So we do see some companies that are using fear, or some companies that are fearful that they're being taken advantage of. And so that's where it comes in, especially as things become hyper competitive for these companies. They can't see a large bloat in their labor cost for people who are not contributing to the workplace at their fair value. One of the challenges there is internal equity. So if me and 3 other professors at the University of Guelph are all getting paid the same, but because we're working remotely, I know I've participated in these 10 activities. My other colleague has participated in 10 activities, but my third colleague, hypothetically speaking, has only done 3 things. Well, then I'm going to feel inequity. And what happens when we feel inequity? Either we put pressure on that person to raise their output, but we're colleagues, so I don't have the authority to put that pressure. So instead, what happens is I decrease my efforts because him and I or her and I are getting the same outcomes,
right,
but putting in different efforts. So what happens is if we don't do performance management correctly, the people who are at the lower end of the performance scale or who are underperforming end up dragging down the others. And so it got a deflationary effect. So companies have a lot of reasons why they want to manage performance.
So I guess human nature being what it is, we don't want to give people a negative review, right? So that is interesting. What do we know about that? I mean, do we have any evidence on how what percentage of performance reviews are just really like way out of line, or, how many are being really honest? Do we know?
Yeah, so there is inflation. Now, there's massive inflation when it comes to performance reviews. Like getting a needs improvement is, people don't know how to absorb a needs improvement. a colleague of mine was telling me she had someone who she had hired on, been with the organization for 6 months and got a Mets expectation. And that individual quit the very next day because how dare the company say that in her 6 months she met expectations and that she wasn't a superior performer. And the company went back and tried to explain that, you were on a learning curve. So you met the expectations of our learning, and her idea was that your expectations must be too high. I'll never succeed here. And they couldn't, they had an impasse. They couldn't bring the person back. And they were like, but we can't just randomly be giving out exceeds expectations and superior performance to somebody who's still learning. Mm-hmm. And so you do hit those areas where people are afraid to give it. Now, we also have been raising a lot of the generation with this failure is not an option, failure is not a risk mentality. And I have to admit that I personally think, and I share the sentiment that others share, that once we stopped failing people from school, failing them from programs, or saying that you don't get a participation trophy, that we're going to recognize the top, but just because you participated doesn't mean you're the winner. I think that those kinds of things created an environment where people are demanding more praise and they're unable to deal with negative news. And there's a generational difference there. There's also a cultural difference there. But that kind of diversity in the workplace is hard to navigate for managers, especially remotely, to try to figure out what's the pulse. Can this person actually take it? If I say to them that this paper doesn't hit the mark,
right,
or this report doesn't hit the mark, or the client is upset with your behavior, or you're late again, can they even take it? Do they have the resilience and the grit required?
So what are you finding then with the younger generation of workers? Can they take it or not?
The younger, it's becoming partially it's generation driven, but partially it's also your personality driven. So what we find is, and research consistently shows this for job performance, people who engage in things like team sports can actually take criticism well. They can actually show up to work and be good, strong performers for their teams. So research shows us people who do things like team sports are excellent in sales jobs because they're able to navigate and have these diverse conversations, and they know it's okay to not succeed all the time, but they've got the resilience to get through it. And so, those kinds of stats do exist, that this kind of person is really well suited for that kind of job, but we don't have general measures of how resilient someone is to all jobs altogether. So, for example, maybe you don't need to be as resilient for a certain kind of a job. So if you're a toll operator, resilience isn't a thing. You're doing the same thing over and over again. It's very directive. But if you are, say, someone involved with strategy or someone who's in marketing, you have to be resilient because sometimes those things are going to fail. You have to be prepared to fail. The risk of failure is high. So you have to be prepared for that risk.
Yeah. So can we just touch on, what is this quiet firing and what's happening with that now?
Oh, that's the nefarious stuff that we're talking about. So quiet firing is where they make the workplace so intolerable for people that they actually, want to quit as opposed to formally getting fired, or they just take people off shifts altogether. And we see this happen a lot with new entrants to the workplace, whether it's immigrants or new grads. They thought they had a job and suddenly they're not on the schedule anymore. So they've been quietly fired. We see this happen with remote workers where they don't get invited to anything, and some of them might accept it, and others are like, oh, well, this is quite insulting. I don't want to work here anymore. And so we do see that happen to remote workers as well. But quiet firing is more this idea that we just reduce the person's footprint and influence at work and the contributions at work from the management perspective to a point where they're not really adding any value, and hope these nefarious companies and hope that these people quit or don't show up anymore. And we don't have to give them anything in terms of reasonable notice or reasons for their exit. We just hope that they disappear and ghost us.
Well, and wouldn't that be attractive to certain companies? Because as you said earlier, it can be very complicated firing people. So this way, you just get them to quit.
Yes, it's attractive for certain companies, but also don't forget, you don't need any sort of formal education to become a manager. You could have just worked in a Panera Bread for long enough that they made you the manager. And now you're just kind of making up the rules as you go along. You've never been given any formal training on how to do performance management, how to navigate difficult conversations, how to, what employment laws are. You just think, okay, well, this person's not performing. They showed up late twice, so I'm not even going to bother scheduling them for morning shifts anymore. And so a lot of this is the fact that managers have been promoted without the necessary skill sets that they need to navigate the management world. And so that's where this concept of quiet firing comes in too. There's a lot of organizations that are doing this, thinking that it's the norm, thinking that it's the best way to get someone out who's not a good fit, rather than recognizing that they have to go through due diligence and progressive discipline when, in fact, you fire somebody.
So I'm going to assume at this point, remote work or hybrid work, that's not going to go away completely, right? It's here to stay. So what do we know at this point about what actually works?
What
works well. And also, if you can talk about at some point, who's doing it well? I mean, you don't necessarily have to give names, but who is doing this well now? Or is it too early still? I don't know. Anyway, your thoughts about all that.
Early. Yeah. So what works well? What works well is bringing people together back to the office with the intent that they will interact with people who they should be working with, who they have something in common with. Bringing them back to the office and controlling that their day is not totally consumed by meetings, giving them the space and the time they need to build that collaboration or get the feedback or get the coaching that they need. Another thing that's really working, and companies that are successful at this, is training the managers on what the new world of work looks like. And that means, how do you evaluate performance? How do you guide people in both locations, remote and online? I put out a challenge in some of my consulting gigs where I'm like, don't set meetings for an hour, set meetings for 40 minutes, and then spend 20 minutes of that time interacting, bringing conversation, talking about the projects and challenges that people have. Use the forum for good and make remote work more successful. I also think that there's a big ergonomics push when it comes to remote work, and encourage our people who are working remotely to think about their ergonomics, to get their massages, to get up from the table. There used to be things like challenges, the step challenge. You could go 10,000 steps. Introduce gamification to ensure that people have healthier lifestyles. And unfortunately, when it comes to the broader societal role of work in our lives, work was a place where we went more hours often than we were at home. And it was a pseudo family. And we had connections and we had relationships, and they didn't all think like us. They didn't all look like us. They didn't all value the same things we valued, but it was a community. And I do think, whether it's even remote workers, if you don't have a community, go out and build one. And it doesn't have to be at work. It could be in team sports. You could go and join a knitting club. You could go for a dog walks group. Go out and make sure that you're doing the things you need to, so that if you are lonely at work, you're not lonely outside of work too, and find your balance.
So if you were to look at the future, like the near future, say, 5 years down the road, maybe even 10 years, where do you see things going?
I see the whole work world being turned completely upside down. I think that the concept of Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 jobs is archaic. I think that it was popularized during the Industrial Revolution around the shifts that factories were open and production lines were open. And I think most knowledge workers should be freed from the shackles of the Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. And they should, in fact, have flex time. I also see performance management going away from more daily task oriented to much more outcome oriented. This was the goal that I gave you. For example, I gave you the goal to teach this class effectively. I gave you the goal to launch this marketing product effectively. I gave you the goal to increase sales by 11%. And the goals become the things that we're evaluating, not the steps to get to the goals. So if somebody can do it much more efficiently, they should be able to do that and still be rewarded at the same level. So I see performance management going from annualized performance reviews, if anyone's even still using those, to more performance coaching, but also a flip of the leader to be much more focused on supporting and eliminating obstacles that prevent people from being successful at work. So the manager and the leader's role will shift from being directive and punitive and controlling to much more What do I do to make you get the job done? Because people do have that diversity of how they work, when they work, where they work, what they value. But if they can accomplish the organization's goals, then they are succeeding.
Whew. Love this discussion, Nita. And we didn't even get into AI. That's a whole other other
I just
podcast.
got some great funding too from the university to do some research projects on AI and HR.
Oh.
And I have started exploring that. And I was like, oh my God, I could spend the rest of my life on this. It's an interesting space to be in.
Yeah. We'll have to talk to you about that. Thank you so much for coming on today.
No worries. It was a great conversation. And I hope that I didn't run the whole conversation in terms of pro remote work versus pro return to office. I think there's benefits of both.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, we're all the captains of our own careers. And I think the time is gone where we think that our employers are going to take care of us. We have to take care of ourselves. We have to develop ourselves. We have to be aware of what the company is doing. We have to be aware of what our future needs might be. And so I really hope that we push people out of that static position we talked about earlier, right? Objects in rest, stay in rest. I want objects in motion. It's time for us to get moving as a society.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, Nita.
No worries. Have a great day.
To you. You too. Bye. That's Nita Chhinzer. She is an associate professor in HR and management consulting in the Department of Management at the Gordon S. Lang School of Business and Economics at the University of Guelph. For more info on Nita and her work, you can check out our show notes. That's it for the show today. We hope you enjoyed it. And if you'd like to know what's coming up on the CRAM podcast, you can follow us on social. Our handle is @CRAMideas. And please help us continue our work. CRAM is a charity, and you can make a donation on our website at cramideas.com. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you back here next time.